In the Legendarium, Wilderland, sometimes called Ravanian, is a wild and uninhabited region of Middle-earth, north of the realm of Gondor, east of Arnor, and historically a part of neither kingdom. In the nomenclature of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien describes the world Wilderland as an invention, not actually found in English, based on wilderness, originally meaning country of wild creatures not inhabited by man, but with side reference to the verbs wilder, meaning to wander astray, and bewilder. Not surprisingly, though people from all over Middle-earth, including hobbits, dwarves, ents, elves, and wizards, refer to the Wilderland, its definition is vague and shifting and depends somewhat on the background of the one speaking. Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week we conclude our discussion of Riddles in the Dark and then move into Chapter 6, Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Fire. Perhaps the only chapter in Tolkien's entire Legendarium that gives within itself a justification for its own title. Our opening quote this week comes from Matthew Dickerson's entry on the Wilderland from Michael Drout's Encyclopedia of J.R.R. Tolkien, and it helps set the stage for one half of the conversation that we're going to be having this evening, because Bilbo, emerging from the darkness beneath the Misty Mountains, has crossed a threshold into a very different kind of world. On the one hand, of course, that isn't a surprise, because Bilbo's entire adventure can be thought of as, a sequence of thresholds strung together by peril. On the other hand, though, this is perhaps the most significant of all the thresholds he will cross, up to and including his descent into the depths of the Lonely Mountain. Welcome to Andrea and to Glorf and David, who are joining me here live tonight. I want to get right into this because we do, for all that this is a fairly, I don't want to say inconsequential, right? That seems unfair. That seems unnecessarily loaded. But it is an interim chapter. It is a chapter that gets us from a major event to a major event. It is existing between the Misty Mountains and Beorn's place, which we'll get to hopefully next week. But I do want to frame all of this out because I think it's real easy, because of exactly that kind of liminal condition, it's really easy to skip over this part of the journey across Ravanian, across the Wilderland, and I want to draw out some elements here that I find really fascinating and share those with you this evening. Let me see if I can call up. Here we are. I've got my first slide of the evening here. This is, of course, Bilbo's map of the Wilderland as redrawn from the Professor's original by Christopher Tolkien. You can tell that by the little runic glyph on the bottom right. And what we'll note here, most significantly, of course, besides laying out the rest of our journey, is that the edge of the wild is marked here on the western side of the mountains. It is marked here on the western side of Rivendell, even despite the usual boundary as we understand it, the Misty Mountains themselves. This, as I say, is depicting Ravanian, as opposed to Eriador on the western side of the Misty Mountains. Ravanian actually translates in Sindarin to Wilderland. But Rivendell, I think we're fairly comfortable understanding here. Rivendell is not the wild. It is something else. It's elves. And Ravanian, as we see it in the course of this book, is absolutely not elves, right? It is connected to Rivendell and the west and to the woodland realm and the east, but it shares thematic and figurative similarities with an entirely different realm from an entirely different author. This is a realm of talking animals and genius loci and freestanding moral codes and obligations and no organized or structured society. Ravanian in the pages of The Hobbit feels more, to me at least, like Narnia than it does the rest of Middle-earth. And we're going to be talking a little bit tonight about why that is true and what we benefit, how we benefit from that, why that is to our advantage as readers and Tolkien's advantage as the author of this piece. I'm going to hold off too on offering an entire comprehensive history of Ravanian, because even by the standards of Middle-earth, it is very complicated. And it isn't anchored in the way that, that Eriador is, or that, the Kingdom of Arnor is, or that Gondor is, or that Eregion is. Ravanian is just kind of, in part at least, a middle ground. It winds up being kind of a dumping spot for the scaffolding that is necessary for the construction of the rest of Middle-earth. So we will talk about that probably on a Sunday episode coming up pretty soon, because it is a fascinating story, but far too complicated for us to go into tonight. Before we get to Ravanian, though, before we get to our talking animals, before we get to being bewildered in the Wilderland, we need to go back. We need to deal with a creepy little dude living under the mountain. We need to wrap up the last two slides of Riddles in the Dark. And I say two, by which, of course, because I'm me, I mean three, because I want to begin not in The Hobbit as we currently understand it, not in the second edition Hobbit, but in, by way of contrast, the first edition Hobbit. Let me show you here, if I can call this up. There we are. We're still, no, I skipped one. We're still working out some problems here. You'll note tonight, if you're joining me live or if you're watching the video after the fact, that I have all my new graphics and things here. I've got my new broadcast platform pretty solid now, but it's still, there's still lag to deal with, and there's still some inadequacies that must be compensated for here in the technical side of production. This is, as I say then, the first edition of Bilbo and Gollum's farewell to one another. "Here's the passage," he whispered. "It must squeeze in and sneak down. We durst go with it, precious. No, we durst, Gollum." So Bilbo slipped under the arch and said goodbye to the nasty, miserable creature, and very glad he was. He did not feel comfortable until he felt quite sure it was gone, and he kept his head out of the main tunnel listening until the flip-flap of Gollum going back to his boat died away in the darkness. Then he went down the new passage. So pretty straightforward, right? As per the rules of the riddle game, as per the rules of the riddle game, brackets, revised after Gollum discovers that he has lost the present that he was going to give to Bilbo as a prize in the first place, Gollum has now led Bilbo to the exit, to the back door, to the east of the Misty Mountains, and it seems amicable enough, right? They part without crossed words. He's a nasty, miserable creature, is Gollum, but that's about the extent of their conflict here, and this is revised pretty thoroughly into the second edition. And I want to call this out. I want to emphasize this because while we often think of that second edition revision, particularly to this chapter, as being a means of repositioning the ring and repositioning Gollum in terms of their importance with regard to the Lord of the Rings, the latter work, rather than just another incident, right? Another of those thresholds crossed by Bilbo in the course of The Hobbit. While we think of those as being the main virtues, the main priorities of this revision, we're here introducing something that is, if anything, I think more important to our understanding of the Lord of the Rings, more important to what makes the Lord of the Rings special. Let's take a look at the revised second edition version of this scene. Bilbo crept away from the wall more quietly than a mouse, but Gollum stiffened at once and sniffed, and his eyes went green. He hissed softly but menacingly. He could not see the Hobbit, but now that he was on the alert, he had other senses that the darkness had sharpened, hearing and smell. He seemed to be crouched right down with his flat hands splayed on the floor and his head thrust out, nose almost to the stone. Though he was only a black shadow in the gleam of his own eyes, Bilbo could see or feel that he was tense as a bowstring gathered for a spring. Bilbo almost stopped breathing and went stiff himself. He was desperate. He must get away, out of this horrible darkness, while he had any strength left. He must fight. He must stab the foul thing, put its eyes out, kill it. It meant to kill him. No, not a fair fight. He was invisible now. Gollum had no sword. Gollum had not actually threatened to kill him or tried to yet, and he was miserable, alone, lost. A sudden understanding, a pity mixed with horror welled up in Bilbo's heart, a glimpse of endless, unmarked days without light or hope of betterment, hard stone, cold fish, sneaking and whispering. All those thoughts passed in a flash of a second. He trembled, and then quite suddenly in another flash, as if lifted by a new strength and resolve, he leaped. No great leap for a man, but a leap in the dark. Straight over Gollum's head he jumped, 7 feet forward and 3 in the air. Indeed, had he known it, he only just missed cracking his skull on the low arch of the passage. Some more there of Bilbo's notable luck. Let me cancel out of my camera there so you can see the whole slide. There we go. So what we see here is not just this more antagonistic relationship, not just this more daring escape, not just this conflict between Gollum, who is now more miserable, more wretched, certainly more evil than he was before, and a newly heroic Bilbo, right? The revisions to Bilbo are few, but they are, in part at least, fairly significant. But it's not just as simple as that, because what we are doing here is introducing the main theme, arguably, I think, the main theme of The Lord of the Rings, which is, of course, pity. This is going to be called back so powerfully in the second chapter of the Fellowship of the Ring, as Gandalf is laying out to Frodo the kind of moral schematic of the entire world. This is not just going to be true for Frodo in terms of his particular quest to Mordor, but is true of all good people across the span of Middle-earth. We do not have the right to judge others. We therefore, in kinship, if nothing else, extend pity. We understand, we seek to understand, and when we don't understand, we still offer mercy nonetheless, right? The distinction there between pity and sympathy in the more traditional sense. So it's introduced here, but of course it's fantastically written. It's extremely deft. It's so skillful that we're so caught up in this moment of conflict, this moment of crisis, and then the relief of escape that we may not even notice it in that moment. But I believe clearly that this is just as emphatically and purposefully a part of the revision as any other element of the Ring or of Gollum. Let's move on then to our final chapter of our final slide, from chapter 5, with a really fascinating, a genuinely fascinating little inclusion here. Bilbo blinked, and then suddenly he saw the goblins. Goblins in full armor with drawn swords sitting just inside the door and watching it with wide eyes and watching the passage that led to it. They were aroused, alert, ready for anything. They saw him sooner than he saw them. Yes, they saw him. Whether it was an accident or a last trick of the ring before it took a new master, it was not on his finger. With yells of delight, the goblins rushed upon him. A pang of fear and loss, like an echo of Gollum's misery, smote Bilbo, and forgetting even to draw his sword, he struck his hands into his pockets. And there was the ring still, in his left pocket, and it slipped on his finger. The goblins stopped short. They could not see a sign of him. He had vanished. They yelled twice as loud as before, but not so delightedly. The ring giveth, and the ring taketh away. I think it's really tempting to see this possibly as an example of the ring's treachery. It is not faithful, right? It will be a faithless object. It will seek to pursue its own agenda. It will, I think we're inclined to see this as an echo of the ring leaving Gollum, right? Certainly that is what Bilbo feels right in that moment. A pang of fear and loss like an echo of Gollum's misery smote Bilbo. He's had the ring for like an hour, no more than that. And here we are now, right? Caught in this conflict, this desire for it. And again, we see the ring having a more immediate and effective emotional impact on Bilbo than is oftentimes supposed by, ring minimalists as you're reading this book and reading into The Lord of the Rings too. As I've said before, right, there's a spectrum of engagement vis-a-vis the ring, depending on how eager you are to read into the text the direct influence of the ring, the direct power of the ring. But here, I read this as possibly, yes, an example of the ring's inherently treacherous nature. We're almost offering this as a nudge to the reader so that we ourselves are not so secure in Bilbo's invisibility for the rest of the book, right? Partly what we're doing here, I think, is establishing stakes. Obviously, it's a moment of conflict, it's a moment of crisis, but it's also an opportunity to reassure the reader that just because he can be invisible when he wants to be invisible doesn't mean that Bilbo is safe. This is obviously going to be extremely significant when we get to Smaug, and if we're remembering this moment as we descend into the depths of the Lonely Mountain, we may well be worried that the ring will once again prove treacherous, that it will once again slip from Bilbo's finger. But while all of that is true and effective, I think, read this as a kind of diegetic power play. I read this as the ring demonstrating to Bilbo its own necessity. I read this as the ring proving to Bilbo, reminding him very powerfully that it can do what it wants, that it is needed, that it is valuable, and that Bilbo's escape, despite what he will tell the dwarves later, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, that Bilbo's escape is entirely dependent on it. That ring, I think, is bad news. I don't know what you guys think. Let's get into our 6th chapter then and move into, past the threshold, right? We're now advancing into, I'm just realizing that I've got a little bleed there on my screen, and I shall try to be more assiduous there. Just my broadcast software kind of leaching into the top of the slide there. As I say, it's a work in progress, you guys. Let's get into chapter 6, and we'll see what we can make of life in the Wilderland out here in Ravanian. Bilbo had escaped the goblins, but he did not know where he was. He had lost hood, cloak, food, pony, his buttons, and his friends. He wandered on and on till the sun began to sink westwards, behind the mountains. Their shadows fell across Bilbo's path, and he looked back. Then he looked forward, and could see before him only ridges and slopes falling toward lowlands and plains, glimpsed occasionally between the trees. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed. "I seem to have got right to the other side of the Misty Mountains, right to the edge of the land beyond. Where can Gandalf and the dwarves have got to? I only hope to goodness that they are not still back there in the power of the goblins." So we're explicitly here calling out this threshold, right? We have the kind of unnatural, because, I mentioned this a little in last week's show about the, what should we say, the permanence, the stability, the unchanging nature of geography in Tolkien's conception, that the world does not shift of its own accord. There are no systems of plate tectonics here in Middle-earth, in Arda in general. Instead, the world is fixed. And thus, the experience of being on the other side of the mountains and now having the sun set behind them rather than rising behind them for Bilbo, right, is a very powerful one. I think it's communicated with a real deftness of touch, just communicating how alien and strange it is for the sunset to be casting these long shadows of the mountains. And if we're coming to The Hobbit from the Silmarillion, as of course many of us are, then we're inclined, I think, to read this as being not unlike the setting of the sun over Valinor, right? We're told that the sun descends. This is back when Valinor is still very much a part of Arda physically, back when it is out there in the west, like geographically as well as symbolically as well as thematically. But as the sun sets over this flat plain of the planet of Arda, it lingers there by Valinor. It bathes Valinor in the last of its light, secluded behind the barrier mountains of the Pelori on the eastern coast of Aman. Valinor gets the light, the west gets the light of the setting sun, and here, in shadow, Bilbo is deprived of that light. He doesn't get the sunset, he doesn't get the benefit of the west, to put it simply, right? He's here now in the east, he's here now in the Wilderland. Chris Stevens is joining us, better late than never, as Chris says. It's good to have you here, Chris. And Richard is also joining us live. Good to have you all here. It's all right, you haven't missed anything good. We've just been talking about Gollum mostly and, getting out here on the eastern side of the mountains. So the threshold here is acknowledged. We are now in a different phase of the story. We're going to, as we move forward through the rest of this chapter, through the rest of the next chapter, through Chapter 7, Queer Lodgings, we're going to be looking at the ways in which the Wilderland pushes back against Bilbo. There's a detail, I don't think I pulled it for a slide, but there's a detail that we're going to get later about the clearing in the forest here. After we survive the avalanche and we kind of slip down the slope and we take shelter in the trees, the clearing in the forest just feels malevolent, that it feels like a wicked place, because it is the meeting place of the goblins and the wargs, as we find out later. But it has a sense to itself that is unlike the places that we've seen in the West. And for all that we've faced trolls, for all that we've faced, difficulties in the journey, for all that the journey has been long, the West is so civilized compared to what we are about to face, right? For good and for ill, because of course we're also going to, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but we're also going to meet Bjorn, who is absolutely a resident of the Wilderland. He's very representative of the Wilderland, despite being a good guy. So the Wilderland is it's easy to see this as a shift from a fundamentally good place with intrusions of evil into a fundamentally evil place with intrusions of good, but I don't think that is fair. The West is settled, it is civil, and the East is wild. That is the distinction, right? Between Rivendell and the Woodland Realm, we're seeing a place that does not know the name of the king, to kind of call that back there. All right, let's move in and get to Bilbo's, well, what? His earning of the respect of the dwarves, I suppose, but his largest omission, his largest moment of deception and deceit so far. Let's get to his reveal of himself. "And here's the burglar," said Bilbo, stepping down into the middle of them and slipping off the ring. Bless me, how they jumped. Then they shouted with surprise and delight. Gandalf was as astonished as any of them, but probably more pleased than all the others. He called to Balin and told him what he thought of a lookout man who let people walk right into them without warning. It is a fact that Bilbo's reputation went up a very great deal with the dwarves after this. If they had still doubted that he was really a first-class burglar in spite of Gandalf's words, they doubted no longer. Balin was the most puzzled of all, but everyone said it was a very clever bit of work. Indeed, Bilbo was so pleased with their praise that he just chuckled inside and said nothing whatever about the ring. And when they asked him how he did it, he said, "Oh, just crept along, very carefully and quietly." A story which the dwarves appear to buy outright, a story which Gandalf appears to kind of mostly accept, at least superficially accept, though certainly he is more skeptical of Bilbo than the others. Again, right, we have the opportunity here to really note the presence of the ring, the influence of the ring. Is Bilbo feeling pleased with their praise? Is he feeling flattered that he now has their respect? Is he feeling satisfied that he has executed this joke, this trick, that he has surprised them all like this? You'll note too, right? Not by appearing on the fringes of the clearing and walking into it now visible, but by getting into the middle of them and slipping off the ring. Now, this is kind of a breaking point for some readers of The Hobbit. Some readers kind of declare this semi-apocryphal, that this is Bilbo exaggerating his own story in the aftermath of the experience, that this is, a cute moment in the Red Book of Westmarch rather than it is a faithful rendition of his experience. But I think that we can make allowances for this primarily because the dwarves are exhausted, right? The reason that they are waiting here, as Gandalf is about to reveal, is perhaps very minimally out of concern and respect for Bilbo. They're giving him a chance, a modicum of a chance, but they're really resting before the next stage of their journey. So it is possible that they are not, as we might picture them, standing around in a perfect circle, shoulder to shoulder, and Bilbo just pops up in the middle of them. It is possible that they are, collapsed on the ground, that they are sitting in little knots, 2s and 3s, all by themselves, and not having that kind of that perfect lookout, right? Balin in particular, of course, is marked as a specific lookout. So I don't know quite what we can make of that. I don't know exactly where the truth of that lies, and that's part of the peril and the benefit of having an unreliable narrator like Mr. Bilbo Baggins. It's hard sometimes to track exactly what happens. But he steps into the middle of them as he reports it, pulls off the ring, appears right there, and they are all very impressed. Balin and Bilbo reintroduce themselves to each other formally, right? Balin doffs his hood and offers his service, and Bilbo does the same in kind, which is a really lovely kind of moment of courtesy, right? Again, we're going to be emphasizing this conflict between civility and the wild, because that, I think, is the real textural difference between these two sides of Bilbo's adventure here. So with all of that then, I guess we need to acknowledge an inconvenient slide, just an inconvenient slide for my favorite pet theory, and here it is. And I'll just call this out right now. This is as Gandalf is considering he's giving the account of the high pass, which he had considered to be safe, but is now revealed to be a goblin trap, and that he has known all about the back door too, that he's known all about the eastern gate here. I must see if I can't find a more or less decent giant to block it up again, said Gandalf, or soon there will be no getting over the mountains at all. As soon as Gandalf had heard Bilbo's yell, he realized what had happened. In the flash which killed the goblins that were grabbing him, he had nipped inside the crack, just as it had snapped too. He followed after the drivers and prisoners right to the edge of the great hall, and there he sat down and worked up the best magic he could in the shadows. A very ticklish business it was, he said. Touch and go. But of course, Gandalf had made a special study of bewitchments with fire and lights. Even the Hobbit had never forgotten the magic fireworks at Old Took's Midsummer Eve parties, as you remember. The rest we all know, except that Gandalf knew all about the back door, as the goblins called the lower gate, where Bilbo lost his buttons. As a matter of fact, it was well known to anybody who was acquainted with this part of the mountains, but it took a wizard to keep his head in the tunnels and guide them in the right direction. So, giants. And I hesitate only because there are a handful of references to giants. If you didn't join me for my discussion of the stone giants juggling act with gigantic boulders during the midst of the storm back in the Misty Mountains before we got down to Goblin Town, then I should reassert for the record that I do not believe that there were stone giants in Middle-earth. I don't believe necessarily that giants are a significant part of the Legendarium, or at least not an intentional part of the Legendarium. As I discussed back then, Tolkien's original conception did include giants. Treebeard was originally going to be a giant, but is then later revised out to be an ant. And I think that what we have here are fingerprints left in the deletion of that previous idea. Giants do not fit our concept of the Legendarium, right? They don't fit our concept they don't have a categorizable taxonomic position here within Middle-earth. What would they be, right? Douglas A. Anderson, as I've said before, in the pages of the annotated Hobbit, a book that I'm a huge fan of and relying on a great deal for the preparation of the seminar series. Doug Anderson holds that the giants are a kind of troll, and that's probably the closest point of similarity, which of course makes a lot of intuitive and thematic sense, right? A certain fairy tale logic at work there. But for me, I'm unconvinced by giants. This is I think, this is the note, this is the line, this is the point at which I kind of have a little friction with the idea of giants in the Legendarium, because it's hard to overlook this one, right? Everything else I think can be seen as metaphor. And this can be seen as metaphor too, right? You can stretch the point. I must see if I can find a more or less decent giant to block it up again, said Gandalf, chuckling to himself at the absurd idea that there would be such a thing as a giant, right? Okay, maybe. You can do that if you want to. I don't think it's really textually supported, but it's there nonetheless. And I call this out just because, this kind of work requires a certain intellectual honesty. We don't want to be dogmatic in our positions. We don't want to be too strict in our assessments of the text. We want to be open to other perspectives, to other drawings of inference, and to other ideas about what is actually happening both on the page and behind the scenes. The other thing that I really want to call out here, particularly in the context of this ongoing discussion about the West and the Wild, is this idea that the back door to Goblin Town, if you like, is here on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains, right? The lower gate, the back door, is pointing toward the Wild. It is pointing toward Ravanian, which suggests, by implication, therefore, Goblin Town is oriented toward the West. And I find that interesting in a number of different ways, right? I find that fascinating in terms of what it implies about the daily habits of the goblins, because sure, they're taking travelers who are crossing the Misty Mountains, but we have to ask, right? How many travelers are crossing the Misty Mountains? How many people are really braving these passes? I understand too that the goblins may have shuttered up or trapped the lower passes, the easier roads through the mountains, which forced Gandalf and the others to take this higher road, this more treacherous pass. But nonetheless, how many people are there really crossing the mountains in the first place? So it perhaps suggests something that the orientation of the goblins is aiming west, and we might immediately leap to the conclusion that that is because of their, more predatory instincts, that they are predating upon those of the civil world to the west rather than those of the wild world to the east. But I wonder if there's also the idea, if we can extrapolate from this a little bit, of the goblins' own civility. We talked about how carefully and how thoroughly, how comprehensively we compare goblins and dwarves, right? Not so different, you and I. It's very much a kind of compatible space. And we're attributing to goblins here a social structure, a fixed kind of residence. It's Goblin Town. It's not, the place where we're staying right now. It's not the bivouac that we've established here as we're raging nomadically through the Misty Mountains looking for prey. It is a home. It is a place that belongs to them. And that is a marker of culture. That is a marker of civilization. And I wonder what this does in our understanding of these goblins in particular, right? The orcs of the Misty Mountains in particular, the Gundabad orcs, and what exactly we're to draw from that. Let's keep moving here ever onward as we move towards the avalanche. I was hesitating whether or not I could justify pulling an entire slide for this, and I think I really have to, partly because it's beautifully written, and partly because it is the direct kind of literary response to Tolkien's own experience of his vacation in Switzerland, as I mentioned before. Brian saying here in the chat, so following up on the previous giant conversation, if you squint, an ent could play the decent giant task Gandalf mentioned. It would also support the idea that not all ents are the kind, good ents we get to know in The Lord of the Rings. That is interesting. I do like that. I think that it's the squint, Brian. Frankly, it's the squint that gives me pause there. I am not above in any way, constructing a gossamer thread of speculation and inference in order to basically get to the conclusion that I want to get to. But I do think that I don't know. I'm not at all sure. Does Gandalf have a functional, quotidian, like day-to-day practical relationship with the Ents of Fangorn Forest? Are there other Ents in other places that Gandalf knows about that aren't completely, transparent to the text of The Lord of the Rings? Possibly. I think it's a really interesting idea and would completely honor and respect the professor's initial creative maneuver there, right? His initial desire to incorporate Ents, drawing from this Norse tradition, drawing from this Anglo-Saxon tradition, drawing from the Germanic traditions of, the Jotun, the Eotun, bringing in these great figures of antiquity. folding that into the Legendarium and arriving at the Ents, I think, is a very organic process for the Professor. Certainly you can read about it in the History of Middle-earth. And yeah, I think that we can respect that. And just, yeah, Control F, right? Find and replace all mentions of giants in The Hobbit and replace it with Ents. It works basically just as well. Let's get to, yes, I wanted to talk about the Avalanche here, because this is, as I say, the most directly applicable part of Tolkien's experience in Switzerland is as I've described before, as he relates in that letter. He encounters this, he experiences this avalanche and these chunks of rock coming by him. And this is just so beautifully descriptive. They still went on and on. The rough path disappeared. The bushes and the long grasses between the boulders, the patches of rabbit-cropped turf, the thyme and the sage and the marjoram, and the yellow rock roses all vanished, and they found themselves at the top of a wide, steep slope of fallen stones, the remains of a landslide. When they began to go down this, rubbish and small pebbles rolled away from their feet. Soon larger bits of split stone were clattering down, and started other pieces below them slithering and rolling. Then lumps of rock were disturbed and bounded off, crashing down with a dust and a noise. Before long, the whole slope above them and below them seemed on the move, and they were sliding away, huddled all together in a fearful confusion of slipping, rattling, cracking slabs and stones. It was the trees at the bottom that saved them. They slid into the edge of a climbing wood of pines that here stood right up the mountain slope from the deeper, darker forests of the valleys below. Some caught hold of the trunks and swung themselves into lower branches. Some, like the little hobbit, got behind a tree to shelter from the onslaught of the rocks. Soon the danger was over. The slide had stopped, and the last faint crashes could be heard as the largest of the disturbed stones went bounding and spinning among the bracken and the pine roots far below. I don't really have a great deal of analysis to offer here, except that's really good writing. And the Professor doesn't always get, I think, the credit that he is due for this kind of action writing, this kind of dramatic, physical scene. But for my money, I think this is as effective as any fight scene that we get in the movies, any other kind of action sequence that we get in the world of Tolkien. Okay, let's get ahead now and look at our last conflict of this sequence, but it is an extended conflict. It's a conflict in several parts, and we should talk about Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Fire. All of a sudden, they heard a howl away downhill, a long, shuddering howl. It was answered by another away to the right and a good deal nearer to them. Then by another, not far away to the left. It was wolves howling at the moon, wolves gathering together. There were no wolves living near Mr. Baggins' hole at home, but he knew that noise. He had had it described to him often enough in tales. One of his elder cousins on the Took side, who had been a great traveller, used to imitate it to frighten him. To hear it out in the forest under the moon was too much for Bilbo. Even magic rings are not much use against wolves, especially against the evil packs that lived under the shadow of the goblin-infested mountains, over the edge of the wild on the borders of the unknown. Wolves of that sort smell keener than goblins and do not need to see you to catch you. "What shall we do? What shall we do?" he cried. "Escaping goblins to be caught by wolves," he said. And it became a proverb. Although now we say, out of the frying pan into the fire in the same sort of uncomfortable situations. The intrusion of the narrative voice there at the end, right? This very self-conscious naming of the episode and kind of narrative pivot away from what Bilbo is experiencing. On the one hand, it is absolutely consistent with what we have discussed before. We were talking about this just last week when we were talking about the introduction of Gollum and the danger, the darkness of the tunnels beneath the Misty Mountains. We have seen the narrator of this book do exactly this trick several times, but this is as effective, I think, as any, because if nothing else, it is more pedantic and deft simultaneously than any of the other intrusions that we've seen so far. I love this idea of Bilbo not just hearing these wolves, right? It's so important that he's not just hearing the wolves and he's not just remembering the sound that he has had imitated for him, right? There are wolves that occasionally are found in the north of the Shire, nowhere near Bag End, right? But in the extreme north of the Shire, we know from other sources, there are occasionally wolves up there, and they are occasionally, sent off. They are occasionally fought off by either the sheriffs or some marshalling of militia under the Thane of the Shire, or by the protection of the Dunedain as well, of course, in later days. So they're not completely unfamiliar, but what we're seeing here isn't just this connection, this knowledge by proxy of Bilbo's. What we're doing is synthesizing the stories that Bilbo has been told the tales of wolves that have been relayed to him, the imitations of wolves that have been relayed to him, which is just another kind of storytelling, right? That is a mimetic kind of storytelling too. He is now in this place in his own fictional world where the fictions of that world are becoming real. This is absolutely proof of the influence of Wilderland, right? This is one of the elements of Wilderland that is going to be so powerful as we continue to move forward. So he's thinking of, I would love to know which Took cousin was responsible for this. Partly because I just really love the stories of the adventuresome Tooks. You know, again, I've spent a lot of time. I've spent more time than I ought thinking about the adventures that I now firmly believe Belladonna Took underwent with Gandalf. I think that they probably had some really fun adventures beyond the borders of the Shire, and maybe encountered some wolves there too. But this turn, right, escaping goblins to be caught by wolves, he said, and it became a proverb, the narrative voice tells us, without any kind of acknowledgement of Bilbo's immediate emotional condition. We just launch right into it. It is the fastest zoom out that we do, I think, on Bilbo's experience here. Though we now say out of the frying pan into the fire in the same sort of uncomfortable situations. Out of the frying pan into the fire is attested from the 16th century. It's actually credited in the OED to Thomas More, who in 1532 writes that his adversary, quote, featly conveyed himself out of the frying pan, fared into the fire, end quote, which is a beautifully constructed way of doing. Brian saying there's a movie idea, The Took Adventures. Am I more interested in The Took Adventures than the Young Aragorn Adventures? You know, I rag on the Young Aragorn Adventures as an idea, I think, just because it is so obviously the story that you want to tell. It is absolutely like first thought, first pass. Hey, we're doing a new story set in Middle-earth. What should it be? Obviously, it should be young Aragorn. So I guess I'm just being slightly contrarian by pulling for, you know, the adventures of Belladonna Took and Gandalf. But there is textual support for it. I will pick that hill, I guess, to die on. One of the many hills to which I am deeply, deeply committed. I will note that though out of the frying pan, and into the fire is attested in English from that 16th century quote from Thomas More, it obviously goes back much further than that. There are versions of it going back into ancient Greek poetry. The idea, the romantic, poetic idea of removing yourself from one adverse situation and winding up in another is, of course, just... It's so tempting to balance these two thoughts so symmetrically around that pivot point of your own experience, your own. It's not just experience, right? It is your own action. It is not that you fall from the frying pan into the fire. It is that you leap from the frying pan into the fire. You are taking an action to remove yourself from a bad circumstance and winding up in an equally bad circumstance, if not a worse circumstance. There is a weird version of it with a sea dog. I believe it's sea dog. It's described as, which I take to be like a dog shark, but I don't really understand exactly what is happening in that original version. I should probably look that up and learn a little more about it. Let's get, though, to our wargs, because if we're talking about the wild, if we're talking about the Wilderland, if we are talking about the ways in which this part of Tolkien's Middle-earth is most similar to C.S. Lewis's Narnia, then it is in the talking animals that we find the embodiment of that similarity. So let's get here to our encounter with the wargs. I will tell you what Gandalf heard, though Bilbo did not understand it. The wargs and the goblins often helped one another in wicked deeds. Goblins do not usually venture very far from their mountains unless they are driven out and looking for new homes, or are marching to war, which I'm glad to say has not happened for a long while. But in those days, they sometimes used to go on raids, especially to get food or slaves to work for them. Then they often got the wargs to help and shared the plunder with them. Sometimes they rode on wolves like men do on horses. Now it seemed that a great goblin raid had been planned for that very night. The wargs had come to meet the goblins, and the goblins were late. The reason, no doubt, was the death of the great goblin and all the excitement caused by the dwarves and Bilbo and the wizard for whom they were probably still hunting. In spite of the dangers of this far land, bold men had of late been making their way back into it from the south, cutting down trees and building themselves places to live in among the more pleasant woods in the valleys and along the river shores. There were many of them, and they were brave and well armed, and even the wargs dared not attack them if they were many together or in the bright day. But now they had planned with the goblins' help to come by night upon some of the villages nearest the mountains. If their plan had been carried out, there would have been none left there next day. All would have been killed except the few the goblins kept from the wolves and carried back as prisoners to their caves. Because we know what goblins want, and it is prisoners, right? We know that from the Goblin Song, as we discussed last week's reading, two readings ago now, I suppose. Wargs are fascinating. I think. They're one of the most oddly distinctive creatures in the Legendarium, despite the fact that they are really, really just wolves, right? They are just, he derives the word warg from the Old English warg, or the Old High German warg, which mean strangler or choker. That's the original meaning, but he takes them, he explains this in a letter to author Gene Wolfe, who was 35 years old when he wrote to the professor seeking clarification on some of the nomenclature. And in letter 290A, Tolkien writes in reply, quote, "Warg is simple. It is an old word for wolf and also had the sense of an outlaw or hunted criminal. This is its usual sense in surviving texts. I adopted the word, which had a good sound for the meaning, as a name for this particular brand of demonic wolf in the story." End quote. And I'll asterisk here just to say that if you're not familiar with Gene Wolfe and his work, he is a really fascinating and sometimes genuinely brilliant writer. His series, The Book of the New Sun, is fantastic until it very suddenly isn't. The last book is really, really bad. But prior to that, it is kind of an unparalleled work of world building and intertextuality, right? Connections within the text to the text. It is only a matter of time until I cover the first book, the Shadow of the Torturer, the first book of the first book of the Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, over on Stars and Swords. That's going to be a great day when we finally get to talk about that. It contains one of my favorite chapters in all of literature. I think it is absolutely fantastic. The description of the library near the very beginning of the book, I just think is among the most sublime things that I have ever read. And it is conceptually so ambitious too. Tons to love about the work of Gene Wolfe. The other thing that I'll call out here, well, okay, firstly, let's note the, luck, chance, if chance you call it. Let's note the intrusion here of actual catastrophe, right? just common or garden catastrophe, not the usually good Tolkienian kind, but just a regular kind of piece of bad luck. The reason that the wargs are here is because they are planning a raid on some of the villages to the south. That's why they are here on this particular evening. That's why they are here in such force. That's why they are here waiting for the goblins. It isn't at all clear, by the way, what men Tolkien is referring to through this sequence, because there's nothing south. I should have prepared the map here just to demonstrate exactly where we are here, but there's nothing south of where we are now except Lothlorien, and then across the Anduin to the east, like Dol Guldur and that southwestern spur of Mirkwood. And south of that, there's nothing until you hit the Wold. You hit the eastern part of Rohan, and the boundaries of both the Riddermark and Gondor seem to be pretty fixed at this point in history, which would encourage me to read this as the intrusion of Easterlings into these lands, into the Vale of Anduin, as it's known. But the way that these men are described, brave and bold, I'm not sure that those are our guys. I think that pretty comprehensively rules out Easterlings as intruding here. So I'm not entirely sure. As I say, the history of this particular area, the logistics of this particular area throughout its long existence are very, very complex. I like very much that we position the wargs as being sapient, as being capable of language, but it is their own twisted dark language, which Gandalf understands and Bilbo thankfully does not. And so the narrator doesn't give us attributed dialogue, right? The wargs do not on the page speak. We are just told what it is that they are communicating, which I think is a really great way of bypassing this question of talking animals. And I should kind of bracket this out too, because this is a point of friction as we're moving from The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings, is of course that in The Lord of the Rings there are no talking animals. I know there is the fox. There is the fox who thinks to himself that it's weird to see hobbits out so late at night in the Shire. But that is the only example that we get of any kind of attributed dialogue or voice at all to animals in The Lord of the Rings. And here they're kind of all over the place. So, but that also fits in with both the fairy tale convention of, for example, the troll's talking purse. I think that matches very, very symmetrically there. And also this idea that we are now in a different part of the world, that the wargs are limited to the eastern side of the Misty Mountains. And again, right, to kind of call back to that idea that Goblin Town is oriented westward. That's why this is the back gate of Goblin Town. I find it curious that they're raiding here and not out into the west, except, of course, out there into the west, there's nothing to raid, right? There aren't any villages out there in Eriador, right? Not anymore, at least, or not for a good ways west. They're not going to come down from the Misty Mountains and go and raid Bree, for example. There are villages out there, but not that many, and they're a great distance from the mountains. So the exact geography here is a little soft. It's a little squishy. Let's enjoy one of the great narrative pivots that Tolkien gives us in this book. Because for all that Tolkien's a very complex and, in his way, ambitious storyteller, right? The narrative structure of these stories is generally pretty straightforward. And by these stories, I'm including The Hobbit, and I'm including The Lord of the Rings, and I'm including basically all of the constituent parts of the Silmarillion. Each story itself is usually pretty straightforward, and he picks a register and kind of stays there, right? There are exceptions to that, obviously, and we do move around within that register, but generally speaking, we're going to stay pretty close to our subject matter. And here we take this great pivot away from the dwarves as the situation is worsening, as it's just turning awful, and right here among the pine trees and the larch trees too, I suppose. We pivot all the way out to the birds, and I want to pull our introductory passage here from the eagles. Eagles are not kindly birds. Some are cowardly and cruel, but the ancient race of the northern mountains were the greatest of all birds. They were proud and strong and noble-hearted. They did not love goblins or fear them. When they took any notice of them at all, which was seldom, for they did not eat such creatures, they swooped on them and drove them shrieking back to their caves and stopped whatever wickedness they were doing. The goblins hated the eagles and feared them, but could not reach their lofty seats or drive them from the mountains. Tonight, the Lord of Eagles was filled with curiosity to know what was afoot, so he summoned many other eagles to him, and they flew away from the mountains, and slowly circling ever round and round, they came down, 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 toward the ring of the wolves and the meeting place of the goblins. And then we're going to cut away from the eagles and then cut back to the eagles in just a few moments. And this is really important because, well, there are a couple of outstanding questions about the eagles that I feel get brought up from time to time among Tolkien fans. I feel that, Tolkien fans, casual Tolkien viewers in particular, right? Why can't they take the eagles to Mordor? Well, we're going to have two answers to that question right here in this chapter. And they're both extremely, I think, compelling, almost bordering on the definitive. Eagles are not kindly birds. Some are cowardly and cruel. Okay. That is true of eagles in general, but the ancient race of the northern mountains were the greatest of all birds. They were proud and strong and noble-hearted. They did not love goblins or fear them. Okay. When they took any notice of them at all, which was seldom, for they did not eat such creatures, they swooped on them and drove them shrieking. So we're not seeing here a patrolling force of eagles out here guarding the border between the West and the Wild. The eagles are not active in their pursuit of goblins on a daily basis. Rather, they are kind of apathetic toward the goblins. And if their paths cross, then they're going to foil the goblins' plans for wickedness and treachery, right? They're going to drive them screaming back into their caves beneath the earth because they hate them, but not out of any greater sense of principle, not out of any greater sense of goodness or of justice, or even of protecting those below them, the men who live here in the Vale of Anduin, or the other creatures who live in the Vale of Anduin. So it's interesting to think about how this matches up with our understanding of eagles coming out of the Silmarillion, right? Our stated purpose in this review of The Hobbit is to consider The Hobbit in the light of the Silmarillion, and obviously the eagles in the Silmarillion are not just unambiguously good, like capital G good, but are one of the greatest and most positive and most virtuous forces in all of Middle-earth. They are positioned more than once as being the kind of thematic counterpoint to the Balrogs, but also like a very effective military counterpoint to the Balrogs, right? You'll remember that when Eärendil comes in to fight Ancalagon the Black, the first winged dragon, Eärendil himself comes down in his ship to battle this dragon, and the eagles are with him. That's how powerful they are, how important they are, servants directly of Manwë. But these are not those eagles. I mean, they are descended of those eagles. These are, the ancient race of the northern mountains, right? We can infer as a direct allusion back to the eagles of the First Age, the eagles of Manwë directly. But all things in Middle-earth diminish. And that seems to have been true of the eagles too. it would be a mistake, I think, to look at the great eagles, Thorondor, and in the First Age, right? Who is both capable of such feats of physical strength and capability, right? It can really defy the forces of Morgoth, but also enormous compassion, an enormous sense of justice, an ability to interpose themselves between the darkness and the light, right? Really trying to well, and also embody the light too. There is something here that has been diminished, and I think we're presented with that fairly carefully. And this is all a part of the wild. This is all a part of what the world is like out here in Ravanian, right? The eagles are independent. This is one of the ways in which I delineated the difference between the West and the wild earlier, is that the West is ordered. It is structured. There is a sense of law in most places, most of the time, right? And there is a sense that even if you are the trolls, that you are breaking the law, right? But you are existing as a counterpoint to society. Here in the wild, there functionally is no society. There is no operative society west of the Woodland Realm, and we can talk about how operative the Woodland Realm is when we get there. But I think it's interesting to see here that the eagles are positioned as fiercely independent and kind of casually indifferent to everyone else. We're going to talk a little more about that as we move forward. First, though, it's poetry time. We absolutely have to take a look at the Goblins' song, which I'm not going to break. I've kind of combined both parts of their song here, and I'm not going to break this as thoroughly as I have broken some of the other songs, partly because we're almost out of time already. I can't believe that is true, but here we are nonetheless. Let's take a look at this and see if we can spot the differences between this song and the previous Goblin song that we have seen and some of the other songs as they have been presented to us. 15 birds and 5 fir trees, their feathers were fanned in a fiery breeze, but funny little birds, they had no wings. Oh, what shall we do with the funny little things? Roast them alive or stew them in a pot, fry them, boil them, and eat them hot. And then we have the break in the action, and we come back with the second part of the song. Burn, burn, tree and fern, shrivel and scorch, a fizzling torch to light the night for our delight, yahey! Bake and toast 'em, fry and roast 'em, till beards blaze and eyes glaze, till hair smells and skins crack, fat melts and bones black, and cinders lie beneath the sky, so dwarves shall die, and light the night for our delight, yahey, yahari hey, yahoy. I mentioned back when we were talking about the first Goblin song that this is the point of continuity between the Goblin songs of the Hobbit and what we hear from the orcs in The Lord of the Rings. You'll remember that when we were in Cirith Ungol, Sam overhears the orcs singing variations of yahey, yahari hey, yahoy. We're getting a direct echo there back to this kind of song. Andrew is saying you can practically hear them stomping the beat. You absolutely can. It is every bit as rhythmic as the Down to Goblin Town song that we discussed before. And it has a very similar kind of affect here. Though what I find most interesting is the way in which it draws almost a direct contrast with a very different song. We talked previously about this contrasting of the goblins and the dwarves, which is certainly effective, certainly compelling. But here I think we might be inclined to read a contrast between the goblins and, believe it or not, the Tralalalali elves. Those elves that we meet that are, where are you going? The river is flowing, your beard's all a-wagging, right? They are singing in this moment, this exuberant, joyful, happy, celebratory moment of immediacy. They are describing the world as they experience it. And the goblins are kind of doing the same, or at least they're beginning in the same place. They're rooted in this immediate moment, and they are also celebratory. They are laughing, they are joyful, although it is obviously a much crueler, more vicious, less humane kind of laughter, kind of enjoyment here, right? Funny little birds, they had no wings. Oh, what shall we do with the funny little things? Roast them alive or stew them in a pot, fry them, boil them, and eat them hot. Again, right, we begin in this immediacy, but then just like the Down to Goblin Town song, we're seeing them kind of begin in the moment and then move forward, kind of envisioning what is going to come next. In that prior song, we get to the point of, the prisoners are working deep beneath the earth, right? Work, nor dare to shirk, right? That's where we're going to be eventually. That's why we are taking these prisoners in this moment. So we're singing about where we are going, and we get the same kind of thing here as we're celebrating right? We begin to burn, tree and fern, shrivel and scorch, a fizzling torch to light the night for our delight, yea. And then we begin moving forward kind of temporally. We begin anticipating what is going to come next. Bake and toast them, fry and roast them, till beards blaze and eyes glaze, till hair smells and skins crack. This is what is coming. And this is violent and ruthless and cruel. It is intended to cause pain very directly. It's not even about the utility of prisoners, right? Which, as gross as that is, you can at least understand, okay, well, they want workers for their mines deep beneath the misty mountains. It makes a certain kind of objective sense. But here we're seeing something that is much more about this sadistic pleasure in hurting and torturing these dwarves and lighting the night for our delight, right? So dwarves shall die and light the night for our delight. There is a direct one-to-one comparison with the pain caused by the fire and the pleasure taken in the light of the fire. Goblins. Maybe not the best. Let's get to our last slide of the evening, which is the other, in case you're wondering, irrefutable return or irrefutable response, I should say, to why can't they just take the eagles to Mordor? The Lord of the Eagles would not take them anywhere near where men lived. They would shoot at us with their great bows of yew, he said, for they would think we were after their sheep, and at other times they would be right. No, we are glad to cheat the goblins of their sport and glad to repay our thanks to you, but we will not risk ourselves for dwarves in the southward plains. Very well, said Gandalf. Take us where and as far as you will. We are already deeply obliged to you, but in the meantime we are famished with hunger. I'm nearly dead of it, said Bilbo, in a weak little voice that nobody heard. That can perhaps be mended, said the Lord of the Eagles. And thus we go to the Eyrie and we have the great detail, right? As the Lord of the Eagles here is saying, well, we're not going to take you where men live because they will shoot us with their bows because they're going to think that we're after their sheep. And sometimes, nudge, nudge with a wingtip here, they would be right. How do we know that they would be right? How do we know that this isn't a joke? Because when we get to the Eyrie, they cook up for themselves a small sheep. There is a sheep among the meats that are prepared for our dwarves and our hobbit. I believe it is 3 days at this point that Bilbo has been without food of any kind. I believe it is 3 days since Bilbo has eaten. 3 days beneath the Misty Mountains. 2.5, I believe, technically, but you know, we're going to round that up to 3 in terms of our appreciation of Bilbo's stalwart nature. So why can't they just take the eagles to Mordor? Because the eagles are super vulnerable to being shot with arrows, right? A very real threat that would oppose them. You know, I don't have to tell you. You're listening to the live recording or the podcast version of, you know, a Tolkien seminar series. Like, you know why they can't take the eagles to Mordor, but nonetheless, it's pleasant that we have 2 direct responses right here. It is already 10 o'clock. I can't believe it's already time for me to wrap this up. I will be going live in 15 minutes right here on the Patreon page. If you support Next Word with a sum of dollars per month, then you can join me in 15 minutes for Last Call at the Green Dragon. We're going to be talking a little bit, I imagine, probably a little bit more about talking animals, probably a little bit more about the eagles, but we're also going to be talking about replication in structure between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, similarities between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings in terms of how their plots are laid out and how the narrative structure operates, the degree to which there is a similarity and the degree to which I think that similarity is oftentimes overstated by bad faith arguments. We'll talk about all of that in The Last Call in the Green Dragon later this evening. Thank you guys so much. Oh, let me not, in fact, get out of here before I share with you my schedule for the next couple of weeks. It's very straightforward, except that apparently I have listed Chapter 7 twice, which is probably not the best. September 9th will be Chapter 7, the actual Chapter 7, Queer Lodgings, and September 16th, Chapter 8, Flies and Spiders. I'm not at all sure that we're going to make it through Chapter 8 in 1 week. There is a lot to discuss there as we really start getting into the first kind of protracted major conflict of the book. And there's a lot to get into as we get into the Mirkwood and as we start dealing with the spiders. So we'll see how that goes. You know, I'm not necessarily promising that we're going to cover a chapter per week for the rest of the series, but we'll you know, try and keep a brisk pace as we move ever onward toward the Lonely Mountain. That is going to do it for this week. Thank you all so much for joining me live. It has been such a pleasure to have you all here with me this evening. I hope all of you, some of you, many of you will be able to join me for the last call in just a little while. I'll be back next week with more. Until then, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for your support. I will talk to you again soon. Until then, take care. Good night, all.